My name is Ben Lesser, and I'm 86 years young. I'm willing to answer any questions. Reddit, ask me anything. I'm here. As long as I can, I will answer them. I didn't realize in the beginning to what extent. I don't think no one really knew to what extent. Remember, I was only 10 and a half years old at the time. We had very little to do with politics. Now, if my parents knew something, it's possible, because Kristallnacht was actually 1 year before the war broke out in Germany and in Austria. Many Jewish people were killed. They were killed by Hitlerjugend, by the SS, by the Gestapo, and they were burning Jewish temples, and they were burning Jewish literature, and all of this happened a year prior to the war, but I didn't know about it. Again, if my parents knew, they didn't tell us kids. But no one really expected to what extent it will lead. My parents may have expected discrimination or some problems with their businesses, but no one could expect or see this coming. It just was too far for the human mind to imagine. I would preach and tell them they have to stop the hatred. And it begins in schools, sometimes as young, in elementary school, just by bullying. When you bully someone, you make an enemy for life. And this is where it starts. I remember as a kid, on Sundays, we were afraid to walk out near a church, because after the sermons, when the kids came out, they would look for Jewish people to beat them up, as throw rocks at them. It all started with hate. And hate has to be stopped in any shape or form. The purpose of moving people from camp to camp, there are two purposes. The first one was people arriving into Auschwitz. Some of them, of course, were scheduled to go to the gas chambers. People who were able to work, they either needed them in Auschwitz, but some of them, other camps and other manufacturers were asking for labor. So they moved us. In my case, they moved us to a other camp, which was Dernhau, which was a rock quarry. We heard cannon fire one night, and that morning, instead of going to work, they told us on a loudspeaker we're being evacuated out of this camp. And they lined us up in rows of 5, and they started to march us out. And as the front came closer and closer in, for some reason, they were moving the labor force further inland. Now, why they were doing this didn't make much sense, because they didn't feed us. They starved us on those death marches. So if we're supposed to be labor for them, how could we labor? We became Muslim, they call them, skin and bone, like walking skeletons. So it didn't make much sense at that point. But I think they didn't know what to do with us. We arrived to Buchenwald, 3 weeks of death marching, and very few of us still survived. Those who survived, they evacuated Buchenwald the following day, they told us, and they put us in cattle cars. So this is how it happened. Most of the evacuation was in order to keep the labor force from being liberated. For some reason, they either didn't want us as witnesses, or they just needed labor, which doesn't make even sense, because feed us if you want us to labor, which they didn't do. So I don't know the real reason, but the main reason was they just didn't want us to be liberated. During imprisonment, I didn't see anything, but prior to imprisonment, I saw where the head of the Gestapo in the ghettos that we were actually saved my sister Lola and my parents for a while anyway, myself. We're here today because of what this head of the Gestapo, the one act that he did, it's too long of a story, but was certainly uplifting to me. So it pointed out that not all Nazis were necessarily bad. There were some that tried to do something against their doctrination, but very few and far in between. Very good question. Of course, I was overwhelmed when we arrived to New York Harbor and we saw the skyline, the New York skyline. It was like being in an outer world. It was something we couldn't even grasp, at least I couldn't. I didn't know that this ever existed. But when we came into America, I was actually about almost 18 years old at the time. I made the commitment to myself, Ben, this is day one of your life. This is where you start. We will not forget the past, but from this point on, you have to go, can only go one way, is succeed. In whatever you do, if you really, really will it, and if you work hard, I will succeed. And at the age of 18, I started coming to America without a language, without money, practically without family, and without education. My education stopped at age 10 and a half. No trade or profession. But yet, I feel I was very successful and I built a life for myself, a beautiful life. So obviously, I was very thankful, and I can only tell anyone who is listening to me, have a positive attitude of life and you will succeed. At the beginning, I don't think most people were interested. They heard what happened to the Jewish people, but they really didn't show too much interest. And that bothered me a lot. But I didn't know too many people outside of our own survivor group, because at my age, and I didn't speak the language, so I only mingled among our own. At that point, I kept it to myself. I did not want to tell the world how to behave. I was just building a life, and that's where my direction went. And I did not try to change other people's mind. But once I reached a certain point in my life where I had children of my own, and for a long time I didn't want my children to even know about what happened to me, to their father. They knew that I was a survivor, that I was in camps, but I never told them the details, and they didn't ask. I'm sure they knew, they must have wondered, why don't we have grandparents or uncles and cousins? We're a limited, small family. But they didn't bother to ask, and I didn't volunteer to tell, because I wanted them to grow up like normal American children. It wasn't until my grandson, at age, he was going to 5th grade. He says, comes to me one day, he says, my teacher found out that you're a Holocaust survivor. Grandpa, would you mind very much to come to our class and tell us about it? That's when I had a big decision to make. I kept silent until now, but my grandson is asking me. I decided to go. Now, what do you tell in fifth grade to fifth grade kids? I really had an awful decision. I couldn't make up my mind. But when I came to the door, I took a deep breath and I walked in. The time allowed for me to speak was from 10 to 11. I started to speak from 10 to 11, from 11 to 12, and none of the kids budged. They were like glued to their chairs. And the school bell rang for lunch. Nobody would budge. No one wanted to move. So the teacher made them go out. In the hallway, they surrounded me with questions. Forget about lunch. They wanted to know answers. That's when I realized we cannot keep silent. We have to let this world know what's happening. And from then on, I started to speak. And I haven't stopped to this day. I'm still speaking. It's hard to point out a single moment. The moment when my sister and my little brother were pulled away from me, never to see each other again, that was something that stands out in my memory. There were other very important points. My marriage to my wife, I call her the love of my life for the last 65 years, Jean. That's a moment that stands out. The birth of my children stand out, and grandchildren stand out, and now great-grandchild, and possibly a second great-grandchild coming on the way. This stands out because despite Hitler, I'm doing something to show him that you didn't win. Hitler, you lost. We're here. Our families are getting larger. And this is something that are very important moments in my life. And of course, there were some sad moments too, but those are the most important moments. I believe it can happen again, and it has been happening in different countries, in Sudan, in Darfur, in Kosovo. It has been happening, not to the extent that that happened to the Jewish people, but killing is killing. And apparently, the world hasn't learned the lesson yet. But one thing I do know is that as long as there is in Israel, the Holocaust to the Jewish people will never happen again. They will never allow it to happen. This is how the state of Israel was born from the shadows, from the death camps. And I felt that the souls of our dear departed ones, all 6 million of them, were crying out at that day at the United Nations to the delegates to vote for a state of Israel. The first time in history is that Russia and the United States voted the same way. So that was a miracle. Something happened, and Israel was born. With all the miracles, my God. Right afterwards, they were surrounded by 6 Arab countries, and a war began to these few survivors who didn't even have a gun to shoot with. And yet there was a miracle. They were able to succeed. And then again, another war, another war, another war. What? I think Israel is blessed, and it's there, gonna stay there forever. And as long as we have an Israel, I feel very supportive of that country. there's not going to be a Holocaust that I know of against the Jewish people anyway. In order to live a life that matters, it's important that whatever you do, you be the best in that profession, whatever you're doing. Because this is what I believed in, and I succeeded by being the best. Not second best or just about the best, no, I had to be the absolute best. When I worked for a company, and I worked for many companies, I always wanted to find out what is it that I can do to make the company that I work for prosper. And I'll find out. I used to find out exactly what other jobs can I do, and if I didn't know them, I would learn them. And don't use an excuse that you had a deprived childhood. I had a deprived childhood. From age 10 and a half, I lost my family, my whole life was disturbed, was running, hiding, and a lot of deaths that I witnessed, and I had nobody, and then concentration camps and so on. Certainly, you would say I had a deprived childhood, but I made a beautiful life for myself. I believed it's all a matter of choices. The choices are up to you. If you choose to succeed, you will, but don't find excuses. In this wonderful country, there is no reason for excuses. If you want it, you work hard, study hard, you will succeed.